Well, hello everyone.
Yeah.
I'm going to say that again. Hello everyone. Yeah, that's still too weak. One more time. Hello everyone. There you go. A little better. I really want to welcome you to today's discussion, Awakening Our Democracy, What's at Stake at the Midterm Elections. My name is Dennis Mitchell, and I serve as the Executive Vice President for University Life. And I'm really excited about today's discussion. Awakening Our Democracy is one of our signature series events that brings us together as a community across Columbia to discuss critical issues of our time through conversations with our thought leaders, advocates, journalists, and scholars. Today's conversation will be a moderated panel discussion for the first segment, followed by a Q&A session afterwards. And we have a wonderful panel of experts who I'll introduce in a little bit later. First, I want to share a quick word about University Life. We are a hub of Columbia student life. We share information, resources, events, and initiatives that support inclusion and belonging, health and well-being, and community citizenship, including many opportunities for students and others across this university to connect and to get to know each other. Some logistics for the day. Just want to talk about questions. Thank you to so many of you who submitted questions in advance. We are grateful. When we get to our Q&A session, the staff members will be circulating with microphones for those of you who have submitted questions to share, so thank you. If you're watching via live stream, and hello live stream folks, good to see you. Please send your questions via email to universitylife@columbia.edu. I'll repeat that for the live streamers, universitylife@columbia.edu. This event is being recorded and will be posted on University Life's website within the week. Now, on to today's event. Whatever your view of the United States Supreme Court's June decision on abortion, Dobbs versus Jackson, we can all really agree that overturning Roe v. Wade really was a watershed moment for this country. And it continues to have ripple effects across the political spectrum during a time already characterized by deep partisan divide. And American democracy being the ongoing experiment that it is, I think we can also agree that conversation is certainly far from over. In fact, in some ways, it's really beginning anew. I concede that today's conversation may not be easy, but that's why it's so critically important for us all to have. I bring my own experience to this room, as we all do, in trying to grapple with the meaning of such a monumental decision. I'm a father of 3 daughters. My eldest is a sophomore in college. My second is a senior in high school and will join college ranks next year. While I serve in this role today, my training and professional experience are both deeply grounded in patient care and public health. I'm a faculty member at the College of Dental Medicine here at Columbia University for over 31 years now, and spent the first 2 decades of my career focusing on oral health needs of underserved communities surrounding Columbia as well as nationally. And I actually had a dental practice that extended through Saturdays up until the pandemic, even while serving in this role. When I look at the Dobbs decision through these lenses, my own lens, I see a couple of fundamental shifts that I never anticipated in my lifetime. The relationship between a patient and doctor becoming politicized in a very new way. Individual rights and liberties being reduced by our federal government in an unprecedented way. And yet, I know that there are those of you who feel a tremendous sense of relief and victory at the decision. Reality is quite messy, and democracy is even messier. Today, we'll dig into some of the complex questions about Dobbs versus Jackson ruling and what it means for Americans, for our democracy, and most eminently for next month's midterm elections. This country's first since the insurgency of January 6, 2021. So, there you have it, the reason for today's conversation. Institutions like ours must aspire to have the appropriate scholarly conversations about the most pressing matters of the day, to better understand them and our own roles in them. I'm looking forward to listening and learning from the incredible group of speakers we've assembled here today. I'm going to share brief introductions of the panels, but I will say this. We have an extraordinary group with us, and I would encourage you to please go online and learn more about each and every one of them. Well, our moderator for the day is Professor Nina Alvarez. She is the CBS Assistant Professor of International Journalism, the Director of Global Journalism at Columbia's Journalism School, our host for the day. Nina is a journalist, documentarian, and video photographer. Over her career, she has reported breaking news and feature stories from around the world on broadcast and web segments, radio reports, and long-term documentaries. Topics in her work have ranged from the experience of immigration to the rights of women and girls, just to name a few. Welcome, Professor Alvarez, and thank you for moderating today. Our panelists for the day: Professor Ester Fuchs, Professor and Director of the Urban and Social Policy Program, Columbia School of International and Public Affairs, and Political Science Professor. Professor Fuchs is an expert in urban politics and policy, American politics, and American parties and elections. She served as the special advisor to the Mayor of Governance and Strategic Planning under New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg from 2001 to 2005. She is a frequent political commentator in print, broadcast, and new media, and lectures internationally. Welcome, Professor Fuchs. Professor Olatunde Johnson is the Jerome B. Sherman Professor of Law at Columbia's Law School, where she teaches and writes about a range of public law matters, including anti-discrimination law, racial justice, courts, and the state of democracy in the United States. Professor Johnson is a frequent commentator on issues involving civil rights and inequality, the Supreme Court, Congress, and judicial nominations. In 2021, President Biden appointed Professor Johnson to the Presidential Commission on the Supreme Court. Welcome, Professor Johnson. Professor Terry McGovern is professor and chair of the Halbram Department of Population and Family Health and the director of the Program on Global Health, Justice, and Governance at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health. Her research focuses on health and human rights, sexual and reproductive rights and health, gender justice, and environmental justice. Welcome, Professor McGovern. And Professor Eliza Solomon is a professor of Columbia Journalism School, where she directs the Arts and Culture concentration in the MA program, teaching its core seminar as well as an array of other courses. Eliza began her journalism career as a theater critic at the Village Voice, and while on staff there for many years, covered topics ranging from U.S. immigration policy, LGBTQ issues, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, electoral politics, and women's sports. Nowadays, she contributes regularly to national, international, and New York City-based media conversations. Welcome, Professor Solomon. So, without further ado, I'd like to turn the floor over to our moderator for the day, Professor Alvarez. Thank you.
So first I'll ask you, if you haven't done it already, to please come on us again. Thank you, Dr. Mitchell. Thank you all for being here. I have to say, this is a little intimidating. It's a brilliant panel, and I hope I can just get you to say what you would normally say in your brilliance. I'm counting on you guys to carry this, so I will ask very simple questions that I'm sure you will have amazing responses to. So there's a new Supreme Court term already underway. We're on, what, day 4 of a new Supreme Court term, and we're still figuring out, and some may say still recovering from the impact of the last term's decisions, which eliminated the right to abortion, loosened gun laws even more than they were already, curtailed the regulatory oversight of polluters by the agency formed pretty much to fulfill that function, and legitimized a more prominent role for religion in public life as in public schools. So I want to start with a broad question for everyone on the panel. Oh, really? Is that better? Maybe higher?
Yeah.
Can't hear my booming voice. Okay. Is that better? Okay. So what, from your perspective, was one outcome that surprised you? It doesn't have to be just the decision, but perhaps the aftermath or the implications. So can I start with Esther?
Well, being the non-lawyer here, being a mere political scientist, I certainly bow to the lawyers on this panel. But that won't stop me from having an opinion, of course. So, in a true Columbia tradition, that was a joke, guys. Get with the program here. Okay. I know that we weren't supposed to be surprised about the Dobbs decision, and I know that we weren't supposed to be surprised that they overturned Roe v. Wade, but given my age and given that I'm somebody who, knows people who experienced illegal abortions and was around as a semi-adult when Roe was decided, and truly believing in the idea that precedent is something that the court would value, and really thinking that even the most right-wing justices who ascended to the court would get there and get to the Supreme Court and then leave some of that partisanship behind. I was really surprised at the extent to which Roe was overturned. Not the rapidity of the state's response after that I expected, but I really didn't expect the Supreme Court to go as far as it did.
Well, that seems like a natural setup for you.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I've been wrestling with the ways in which I was surprised and not surprised. Of course, we were all, in some ways, put on guard by the leak. And I remember when I got the call, and it was a press call that said, "Do you want to comment on Dobbs?" And I thought, why? It hasn't come out. And then I checked on Twitter, and I could see, the draft leaked decision, and have never read anything so fast. And you see the final decision is not much different from, it's a little bit different, but not vastly different. I think actually what I was most surprised about, and you were good to mention some of the other decisions of this term, but I was surprised by the degree of interest in what had happened from the Supreme Court. I often give talks about Supreme Court terms to lawyers, because obviously I'm a law professor, students of law, but it was just ordinary citizens, as people are called, asking for and wanting to understand the decision. I was surprised by how many of them had read it and read about it, and and asked me very precise questions about the effect on the legitimacy of the Supreme Court. And that was the question that kept coming up over and over again. And we can talk more about this, but I'll just say 3 brief reasons why I think, and then we can talk about them more if it's interesting to people. But one, of course, it's just the overturning of a constitutional right. And whatever you think about, whether this was queued up, whether you agree or disagree, it doesn't happen every day. It was a right that people had relied on for 50 years that now moved from the national level to something that would be decided very differently by different states at the subnational level. I think the second thing, and this really surprised me, is how conscious people were of the methodology of the court, how interested they were in talking about originalism, the use of history. This is something law professors talk about and debate, but it became really clear to people that, or this is how they put it, that women aren't in the Constitution. Of course, abortion isn't in the Constitution, so they're asking, is something wrong with our Constitution? Is something wrong with this methodology? It just became very vivid. And I guess the third reason I think that people were really queued up were, of course, larger trends, and this is all what we're going to talk about, just political polarization, a lot of contestation over the court, the fact that people had witnessed all of these confirmation battles, be it Brett Kavanaugh, Amy Coney Barrett, and even seeing Ketanji Brown Jackson's confirmation hearing. It was very visible, very fresh of mind, and it seemed that, the courts are a political institution. They're not an institution that's removed from politics. And so, so I thought the sophistication of the analysis, the degree of interest, was really striking.
Okay, so of course I agree with everything that's been said, but I have to say, as a person who's worked a lot in Mississippi, I was kind of overwhelmed by the hypocrisy of the decision. So specifically, Mississippi leads the country in maternal mortality for Black women. Infant mortality has 108 outstanding foster care system violations, mostly for kids of color. To hear Justice Barrett say this isn't that much of a bodily imposition, not say worse more than a vaccine, because we simply get the women to carry to term, we terminate their rights, and the children go to safe haven. Now, buried in those statements is so much that's wrong, and so much that is not true and inaccurate. So I guess I was just stunned by the decision's failure to in any way engage the reality of the lives of the peoples whose rights they were taking away. So I agree that even for somebody who expected the decision, it was shocking to me. And it was shocking that it was Mississippi that was able to do it, and the incredible hypocrisy of that state stepping forward in the way it did.
Well, there's not a lot left for me to add.
I'll start with you next.
It's all right. No, I agree, and I was thinking the same thing. I was shocked but not surprised.
Right.
And the idea of the hypocrisy and also the public interest relates to the way the issue's covered, more generally. And I think the court, for the ways that were mentioned, has had a lot more media attention in the last, really since the Trump presidency. But in these last 2 years, and then the leak, of course, put this issue, produced a lot of discussion of the issue before the ruling came down. And so I think people were anticipating it, were reading up on it, and there were opportunities for people in our profession to write or broadcast about it and provide more information. Now, the extent to which that information was helpful or not is something we can get into, whether it was in every case. And I think, the other thing is that I think helps ground this is that nearly 1 in 4 pregnant people have abortions by the age of 40 in this country. That is a huge number of people. So it's not surprising that there would be an enormous interest and concern and care about the issue.
That's a really important point you raised, and I had a question about how much of it had to do with the fact that we all know somebody, most people know someone who's had an abortion, but still will impose this right to life value. So my question is, was that at the heart of this evolution towards a greater support for reproductive rights, or a rejection of the court's decision, or has there been an evolution in our thinking on abortion as an issue of equality? How about?
Why don't I present a little poll data here on what people think about abortion in this country, and then we can look at it in a more nuanced way, because the polls are just a sort of general snapshot. But consistently and for a long period of time, the vast majority of Americans say abortion should be legal. Currently, for that basic question that you see in the polls, it's 62%. If you vary the question wording in some ways, you get different responses. That's for all of you who do public opinion polls. Just understand that there's a certain amount of subjectivity in the way you word a question, and you don't always get the same response. But here, over time, for decades now, we are getting this between 55 and 65% group of the population who favors abortion rights. And when you look at the folks who say that abortion should be made illegal, that's actually a very small percent. 36% say abortion should be illegal. So it's not always, a perfect equation here. Actually, this is not a large number in a very diverse country. And 57% of adults actually disapprove of the decision to overturn Roe, which I don't know if that's unprecedented for the courts, but it certainly speaks to your point about the legitimacy of the courts and the taking away of rights. So when you look at the issue of abortion rights, I actually think that for the public, I don't think, even for women, this was an established right of which people stopped thinking that much about it for those of us who thought abortion should be legal. For those who wanted to make it illegal, not only have they been thinking about it, but they've been mobilizing around it, they've been strategizing, they've been raising money, and they've been obviously very effective in how they managed to overturn this right. So I just think people backburnered it. The last point I'll make is in elections, you for the last 20 years, you did not really see in most places abortions rise to the issue that determined people's votes for those who were pro-choice. So it's a really interesting way to think about things. For those who are anti-choice, they make abortion their primary cue in voting. They were single-issue voters. For those who were pro-choice, they were accepting the idea that this was the law of the land and established, and therefore could vote on the basis of other issues, not thinking at all that this would ever go away as a right.
I have so many thoughts on this because, it reminds me of just another thing in opinion polling and political science, which is around public choice, right? That there's a kind of intensity of preferences that can produce policy outcomes, and more diffuse preferences that people have don't always lead to policy change. But I think that there are also vast regional differences to be attended to. We've been looking a lot at state level data, and I think in almost every state there's a majority support for the more pro-choice view, but the divergences are wider in states like New York and California. Another interesting thing that's really coming out of this is whether there should have been more work done to create an affirmative legislative right, either at the state level and at the federal level by groups that were trying to advance reproductive health care. And a lot of asking about whether or not tactically there were missteps, which I think is kind of complicated. There's more to say on that. But I think it's more that you almost have to reframe the issue as not just being about abortion. It's still more a broader kind of affirmative agenda that gets at what Terry was talking about. So I think those parts of it, I think, are really interesting to think about.
Yeah.
And if I can jump in and say, like, I think one of the reasons that hasn't happened is related to how the abortion issue has been covered by journalists for these last
50 years.
50 years, really. That, you know, relates to a little bit of the complacency that you were talking about, Esther. That it bubbles into the news when there's legislation, restrictions, court cases, and otherwise is seldom discussed. It's typically discussed as a political issue, not as a health issue. And I think this is has had a huge impact on how we understand it, how all of us talk about it, and maybe even think about it. It's political reporters who are assigned stories about abortion, not health reporters typically. And that has a lot to do with then who become the sources of the stories, who's quoted in stories. Congress members, people running for office, advocates from advocacy groups on either side.
Not exactly the health experts.
Not
or
OBGYN experts and providers and the 1 in 4 people who have abortions, and that changes the public understanding of the issue a lot. And then, the language with which these political reporters typically, I know there are many exceptions, typically report it, paint it in a way that hypes up this idea of polarization. And as Esther said, a majority of Americans favor the protections of Roe. But you wouldn't know that from lead sentences that say things like the charged issue of abortion, the polarized issue of abortion, the controversial, divisive issue of abortion. And so that frames it in a particular way that takes away a lot of the nuance on the complexity. And then, of course, there's language. And advocates, I'm sure everybody who's ever worked in any kind of campaign, activist campaign, you try to come up with the pithy phrases that you hope the world is going to pick up and use that favor your side. And the anti-abortion movement has been very effective at this. I mean, first of all, with the term pro-life itself, a more neutral term or a more accurate term for journalists rather than pro-life and pro-choice would be anti-abortion and pro-abortion rights, which more accurately
not
describe-
pro-abortion.
Not pro-abortion, pro-abortion rights and anti-abortion. I think those are more accurate descriptors. But then phrases like partial birth abortion, of which there is no such thing, or heartbeat laws, when no medical professional would assert that the cells that are beginning to form at a point before 6 weeks, even if increasingly sophisticated medical instruments can detect some activity, they wouldn't call that a heartbeat. And yet the legislation that tried to restrict, narrow the period during which someone could get an abortion were called heartbeat laws, and headlines and tweets and so on just picked up that phrase and used it because it's a lot easier to say that in a tweet than it is to say, preliminary cardiac activity or something like that. So, and I could go on, I could give some examples from the press, but I think that these are some of the ways that the issues framed in the public discourse.
I want to come to you, Terry, because I think you hit on something that's really important, which is the perception that we were divided on this. And then you realize that, okay, you have Kansas, and it's like that completely betrayed that narrative that has been accepted, that there are states where everybody supports restrictions and even bans. But I think there's another piece to this that hasn't really been, that maybe has been elevated by what's happening, which is what happens on the ground, the consequences, the ripple effects of these kinds of restrictions. So Terry, can you talk a little bit about how this has kind of manifested itself on the ground?
Sure. I just wanted to first say that I think if we look at Argentina, Colombia, Mexico, Ireland, all the countries around the world who have decriminalized after criminalizing, you see that they, just like the reproductive justice movement here has problematized this concept of choice. What these movements have done on the ground is really talk to people about how many children in their family died, how many women died, and then connect those issues to all of it, right? So it's never just about abortion. It's actually about what reproductive justice asks, which is what are all of the concurrent conditions that put people into a pregnancy that they don't want, right? So I think it's very, very important, this whole discussion about polarized language, et cetera. So on the ground, in the states that have criminalized or in the states where it's now illegal, it's been very, very chaotic. For one thing, HIPAA, protects medical information, but there are exceptions for court proceedings, right? So lots of confusion about, do providers have to hand over the records? Now, to get to the politics discussion, for me to answer the question of a person in Oklahoma in a clinic, I have to actually look at who the prosecutor is, who elected them, what their politics are. We cannot any longer have silos around gerrymandering, voting rights, prosecutors. It's all the same at this point. So lots of confusion. The crisis pregnancy centers, which many of you know, there are many in the Bronx, those are not HIPAA protected entities. They're actually reporting women or pregnant people who are coming in for prosecution. So there's a million questions related to that.
And can I just jump in on that? If somebody, that just to mention that Reveal, which is a great investigative reporting podcast and website, did a study that showed that, or did a story showing how Facebook tracked people who are going online to look at these so-called pregnancy centers and are keeping that information in their profiles that is not protected by HIPAA. And there's a whole long line of these kinds of things that are happening.
So just to say quickly, to inject criminalization into this very complicated picture of people and their bodily autonomy, right, is just the worst possible thing. So obviously in states where abortion is illegal, people have to figure out, they have to travel now 250 miles. I mean, it's just an endless sea of problems. Obviously, ectopic pregnancies, medications that could also induce abortion, miscarriage, all of those are now, providers are freaking out, universities are trying to figure out what their policies are. None of it is good. None of it is, we were moving towards reducing teenage pregnancy. We're moving towards increasing access. Now, we're all spending all of our time trying to stop really terrible harm from happening. So really, and this is of course on top of, remember we had a gag Title X during the Trump administration. So very, very difficult picture on the ground.
So what does this mean for, say, the midterm elections, where we're seeing the fallout of Dobbs and other decisions and what's coming down the pike, but what does this mean for midterms? You just said, there are prosecutors. Who's the prosecutors? Now we really do have to care, because they're going to be, either engaging in the criminalization aspect, or some who have said, I refuse to do that. But much has been said about, well, this is going to turn things around for the Democrats. This is really going to, corner the Republicans. They're backed up into a corner that they can't get out of. I don't think that's happening. I think they've also relied on other issues like immigration and trying to deflect from some of these, but they really have shied away from the most restrictionist or the total ban. Now you have Lindsey Graham proposing this 15-week ban, which seemed counterintuitive, given that in his own party there was declining support for such a thing. So what's the political impact of what's happening, the public opinion, the news reports from the ground, from like pretty much the front lines? What's going to happen? Please look into your crystal balls.
So can I start again? I don't mean to, I'll do it quickly, but I think a contextualization here is important because here we are in New York City and we tend to see the world, unfortunately, very differently than most of the rest of the country. And I think our understandings of elections are, so skewed because we are, a very blue state. And so the extent to which the abortion issue will play out in any given statewide midterm election is actually complicated. And I think because of Kansas, there was a lot more optimism about the role that abortion rights would play in this election. But if I can sort of dial back for a moment to get everybody to understand midterm elections, part of the reason this is so interesting, and part of it obviously is because of these issues, but also because midterm elections are usually sort of low interest elections of which the party in power loses. And, I'm a political scientist and I don't think we predict very well, but neither do the economists, and they pretend they do, so we know we don't predict well. But the one thing that we usually understood from looking at data over time is that midterm elections, the party in power loses. And so part of what the abortion rights issue did is sort of light a fire potentially under a range of voters who may have not turned out in the midterm election. The other thing we know about midterm elections and elections in general is that economic issues dominate. And we were just talking about this earlier. You answer a public opinion poll, right? And somebody either online or on your cell phone, and they ask you your position about a whole range of issues. And most of you, if you're responding to the poll, you provide that answer. Now think more carefully about what are the issues that actually motivate your vote, that cue your vote. Most of those issues they asked you your position on are not going to really have an impact on your decision of who you're going to vote for. And what we know generally is the economy tops that issue. So what's going on now, I think, is just to put a couple of things on the table, which is really why might voters behave differently in this 2022 election, which means that, what would give Democrats the opportunity of retaining their majorities in the House or the Senate. And we won't go into the prognostications on this, but just to put out a couple of things that are very important. Enthusiasm of the voter, or what's sometimes called voter trust. Which populations in the electorate are likely to be most enthusiastic about voting? So that's really about mobilization and turnout. By the way, there's very little turnout without mobilization, and that's hard work, and we don't do it very well. I mean, we just don't. Since I'm sort of, partisan to the old political machines that actually got people out to vote, we don't have those kinds of things anymore that really work very well to get people out consistently to vote. And so, the victor is often determined by a mobilization apparatus. And so you need enthusiastic voters who will turn out. You need the capacity to mobilize. And what else might impact? And I'm just going to throw some things on the table here, which I know we'll talk more about, but the voter suppression laws. Well, we know that those are likely to have a negative impact on turnout. But also, if people get angry enough, it could actually impact turnout in certain states in a positive way. And then, of course, campaign finance, which we are barely talking about now. And, you know, Elisa, I know you'll have something to say about how the press covers that. But, you know, we're seeing some dramatic changes in states like Wisconsin now, which have to do with advertising. Which, you know, advertising isn't supposed to have such a really significant effect on what people decide. But they're putting the Republican in that race, in that Senate race, has a lot of money in advertising to put what issues front and center with voters? Inflation and crime. And crime is just a dog whistle for race, and it's not a dog whistle anymore. Most of the time it's just a loud horn.
I'm going to just interject here because I
Yeah.
do want to go to Alyssa on this point
Yeah.
that advertising, and they don't need the media anymore.
Right.
Right? They don't
Yeah.
need journalists.
Yeah,
They
no,
don't actually want us
They
at their
won't-
campaign
yeah.
events.
yeah, no, it's.
So how do we cover this?
Yeah, so it's really a big problem, and it's a problem for democracy itself.
Which is also
yeah,
an issue, right?
Yeah, voting,
Yes,
you know,
it's a
voter
big
suppression,
issue.
et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, our elected officials are supposed to be accountable to the public. I think, you know, no matter where you are on the political spectrum, I think we all agree that they're supposed to be accountable to us. And one of the mechanisms we have for that accountability is journalism. They speak to journalists who then can ask questions and report their answers. Increasingly, you know, particularly among Republicans, but not exclusively, but predominantly, they're simply refusing to speak to journalists. DeSantis is doing this now, even as he's like, and he's putting out. I won't mince words. He's putting out blatant lies. You know, he said the other day, for example, he accused what he called the national regime media, meaning mainstream press, of cheerleading for the hurricane to hit Florida so he would look bad. You know, which, you know, there is just zero evidence for that assertion, like zero, and it's demagogic and terrible. But there's nobody can ask him a question or press him on it or say, where did you get that from? Because he refuses to speak to journalists. And so, you know, with the availability of social media platforms, advertising, the really uncontrolled amount of money that and dark money that now can buy media time for candidates, it's very, very hard to create that accountability that we absolutely need. And this makes us, you know, look more, if not actually be more, like a number of authoritarian countries, where the strategy, Masha Gessen's written very, you know, brilliantly about this, and others, you know, the strategy for power is to just, you know, flood the airwaves. It doesn't matter if it's inconsistent. The point is to be confusing. The point is to make it difficult for people to know where to look for reliable information. It's to discredit the places that are providing reliable information, and to just create this haze, and that exacerbates polarization.
In terms of accountability, I want to ask Olatunde just about the legitimacy of the court and democracy being at least on the minds of voters, right? At least in polls, they're putting that at somewhere in the top of their list.
Yeah.
But does the justices don't really seem influenced by this? They don't seem to really care. Should they? They're literally, Robert said, simply because people disagree with an opinion is not a basis for questioning the legitimacy of the court. And, you know, and Alito was actually pretty proud that he had been, his decision or his opinion on Dobbs had been lambasted by a whole string of foreign leaders, and he seemed pretty impressed with that as well. And, you know, but then you have Kagan, Justice Kagan, really questioning, like, where are we headed? And this is a, you know, if we're not, what she said is, over time, the court loses all connection with the public and with public sentiment. That is a dangerous thing for democracy. They're at odds here. How do you?
Yeah. So I think it's been interesting, and what you're referring to just are very recent discussions among the justices about this question of legitimacy that I began with. So, a few things. I mean, so one, in a general sense, there is the statement that courts, the Supreme Court, in order to retain its legitimacy, has to be somewhat in line with public opinion. This is an assertion that historians and political scientists have made as a descriptive matter, to say that the court doesn't actually go and diverge that much from public opinion in decisions like Brown versus Board of Education. It may seem like the court was sort of leading the way, but it was tracking a lot of where the country had moved and other political branches, partly as a result of Cold War politics and things like that. Right now, there was a very recent paper by Maya Sen and some other political scientists that say that the court has diverged a lot from public opinion right now. That they have data. It's not just the data on do you approve of the court or not, which I always find a really kind of odd question. But
I have to say this though. Apparently, a Gallup poll on Thursday, the Supreme Court's ratings. Job approval rating was lower than President Biden's, which is pretty low.
It's as low as it's ever been, and it often is. Well, I shouldn't say as low as it's ever been. It's low as it's been dropping, and it's low as it's been in a while. And usually, it's higher than other of the political institutions, is my understanding. And now it's lower. So this is dramatic. It's a dramatic shift, and a lot of it is because of Dobbs, maybe because of Bruin. I don't know how much the climate and administrative law issues have captured the court. So, but it's what I thought was interesting is that the measure was the divergence between sort of the substantive outcome of the court and public opinion, right? That there's a large divergence. And also what's interesting is more generally the concern about democracy that is captured somewhat in polling, but certainly in a lot of anecdotal conversations, is the fear that anti-majoritarian features of our constitutional structure or of our political process are having outsized control and are subverting the will of the majority. So people being concerned about the Senate and its design, but specifically the filibuster, the Electoral College, and then you have the sort of 9 justices of the Supreme Court. And so this is something that we've long recognized and talked about. We talk about in law, certainly, as being both a structural feature of American constitutionalism, but something layered among patterns of political polarization, the way in which we're sort of shifting. And then in addition to that, more kind of identity-based politics, where people associate that with minority, like racial and ethnic minorities, but just sort of the rise of white identity politics, all of that making our political environment more fractured and polarized. And so I think it's really interesting that there is more polling and that suggests that people are very cognizant of these trends, but it's not really clear what to do about them and how to fix those kinds of things, at least at the national level. I will say something specific about the court. I know we want to move into Q&A. So I worked on, I was one of the commissioners on this Biden Supreme Court Commission. We didn't make recommendations, but we do have a report that looks at things like, should you expand the court? Should there be term limits? And I did see in kind of the conversations that are happening after that, and also in some legislative activity, more interest in not just court expansion, but in term limits. There's an interesting proposal by Fix the Court that wants to sort of temporarily expand the size of the court and do term limits at the same time. It's just an interesting proposal to look at, and a lot more public resonance of that. I don't know whether or not it has. These things are big changes to the way we think about the Supreme Court, so I don't know how they're going to move forward, but this is not pie in the sky kinds of things. There is legislation that could achieve these outcomes, and in the abstract, there is actually quite a bit of bipartisan support for term limits because it regularizes appointments and could potentially depoliticize the court. I don't want to say depoliticize, but reduce some of the contestations over the court and the confirmation process.
I know we need to move into Q&A, but I do have one more question. for everyone on the panel, and maybe if people want to start formulating questions and raise your hands so that we can get a microphone to you. But I do want to just throw out this one last question, just about the question of democracy and the goals of an inclusive democracy, and the fact that the Supreme Court seems to be undoing these, not incrementally, but pretty radically. And the term ahead, I'm not sure if anyone's hopeful that things will be less, will go in a different direction. But is this court essentially telling us that, given their interpretation of the Constitution, that the goals of democracy, inclusivity, participation is actually compatible, at least with their reading of it?
I mean, I think that for the members of the Supreme Court, I mean, they push against that, right? They wouldn't say their job is really to define all the contours of American democracy. I mean, one of the things that's interesting if you
Well, they're
read...
not going to put it that way, right?
Yeah, but I want to take your question really seriously, offer my view, but also if we don't understand sort of what's at stake in a vision of constitutionalism, I think it's hard if you're not supportive of that vision to kind of counter it. And I think, you know, one idea, I mean, you see in Dobbs, this repetition that the courts just, Roe was actually the outlier decision. And there are people who have long felt that about Roe. And there's criticism, even from people who support abortion rights, about the way in which that decision was made. Now, precedent matters, and that's what Casey said, so I don't think that that's a full answer to it, right? But there is a vision of, we're going to have this very narrow view of what are rights under the Constitution. We're going to rely a lot on, even if inconsistently, on sort of founders and drafters' understandings, on textual understandings, and then the rest can be sorted out by the political process. And the reason that I mention this is that there are a lot of people who will say, I'm a progressive, okay, writers now, who are saying that a mistake has been made by progressives to focus as much as we do on constitutionalism, and that progressives should focus more on the political process and have abandoned that, and that would be more in the spirit of a true progressive ideas of the 1930s, right? Is that you thought about the political branches, and so more mobilization has to be done then. My own view is that it's a little bit more complicated than that, because the court plays a big role in setting the ground rules of democracy, and we see that in the cases that are going to be tried this or litigated this term. The court is heard yesterday a case on, or was it 2 days ago, on voting rights. The independent state legislature case, which could influence the ability of states to essentially override democratic elections. So I don't think that there's a way of getting the court involved, but I think it's worth really thinking through these different conceptions of what is the role of the Constitution in our democracy.
And if it even, and whether a document created by and protecting propertied white men was ever intended fundamentally to be a primary instrument of participatory multiracial democracy. You know, over time, its principles have been used to expand that, but you know, maybe we're looking at it in too wholly a way.
And I can't resist but saying that. You know, to me, one of the, I think I'm very good at sort of, this is my job, right, as a lawyer and a law professor, to really see a range of sides and opinions on things. The decision I have the hardest time with is Shelby County, in part because of its results. So that's the case in which the court said that Congress didn't have power to reenact provisions of the Voting Rights Act. And immediately after that, it's when states adopted, because they were no longer subject to preclearance by the Department of Justice. You know, these are states that had a history of discrimination. And so they adopted voting changes such as voter ID and other kinds of changes that have arguably the effect of suppressing voter turnout in a very surgical way, right? So minority voter turnout, Democratic voter turnout, okay, racial and ethnic minorities who are not even minorities in some of these states. And the reason I have a hard time with it is the outcome, okay? And also the fact that it was bipartisan, again, 98-0, I think it was, that reauthorized the Voting Rights Act. But it's also that it's very cynical in terms of its methodology, because if you care about founders, you should also care about those who drafted the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment. Those were, the so-called radical Republicans. A lot of them came out of the, were abolitionists, people like Charles Sumner, Bingham. I mean, we should know their names as much as we know Madison and Hamilton. And that's not engaged in the court. Its opinions, the court really relies in Shelby County on an idea of federalism that's very at odds with the vision of constitutionalism that they were trying to urge in the wake of the Civil War. So I think it's just important that I think we can recover those understandings of American constitutionalism. I don't think that they're enough to be fully inclusive. I do think the political branches matter, but I just have a big problem with talking about founders and not talking about those who drafted the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments.
Well, it's very
And
interesting
19th,
Can I jump in on this, just because I think what you say is so profound, what you both have said, and I think the political process was always meant to be a part of inclusive democracy. It was never meant to just be left to the courts or, I keep on thinking about, I taught parties and elections for 20 years, American parties and elections, and the way I, taught it, historical development, but the way it was taught, and these, I used basic texts and all kinds of other articles, was an expansion of democratic rights, as Elise was saying before, an expansion of the of the right, especially to vote, of the franchise. And that, yes, in the period of the founding, the only people who could vote were white males with property. But in fact, the reading of the Constitution itself and the way our political institutions evolved was meant to expand that right. And that was what was happening until it stopped and reversed itself. And I'm still sort of in shock over this reversal, that in fact all of these court cases, particularly these Supreme Court cases that you talked about, Olatunde, that these are efforts to roll back rights and to reduce the goal of an inclusive democracy. So I believe now we're more and more required to rely on the political process in a system that is actually structurally broken. And it's something you said earlier, is that we're in a situation right now where the majority I wrote it down because you said it so beautifully, we're subverting the will of the majority right now in so much of our politics. And this seems to me to get at a sort of, a basic flaw in the structure of American politics. Federalism is not working. The Electoral College does not work. Even the Supreme Court is not working, and we're looking for structural fixes, which I agree need to be made, minimally term limits. And
well, I think there's also just like what we were talking about, just the role of public opinion and the non-role of public opinion, but it seems there's a lot of consideration given to what people were thinking and doing 200 years ago, and how does that make sense?
Yeah, but it's very hard to think about whether or not the court should consider public opinion in its decisions, right? Some people say it's actually an inappropriate constitutional method for the court to say, hey, the public believes that way. I thought where it could have come in differently, just speaking of the Dobbs opinion, is the court says that women have not relied on this constitutional right. That was one of the reasons it gave for overturning it. And I just, I've gone to those footnotes, I've looked at the briefs that are relied on by the court and saying that there was no reliance. And I think that's a real, if you want to take it seriously and on its own terms, just a part of the opinions that's kind of strains credulity. It may be that not every woman has relied on it, right? I think that's fair. But if you that's a place in which public opinion or public reliance could have played a role.
Okay, I think can we have another 2 hours? So we'll take questions. Is there a mic?
Yes, there's two.
Oh, okay. Okay, how about right here? Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. I have a question for all of you, actually. I've just recently read this book by really well-known economist arguing that the declining of white America is creating a lot of hostilities. Historically, 1922, the imposition of Immigration Act was literally to impose people of color from immigrating. I'd just like to ask you questions about like how that is impacting the projectile of the constitutions and maybe democracy in future.
So is the question that the threat that
Right. So I think there's a Gallup poll came out recently arguing that 69% people do not believe that this democracy will hold. About 1 in 3 children are born of people of color. I just wanted to ask questions how that is. I mean, we also see the rise of this malicious group, right, attacking democracy and Roe v. Wade. I'm just trying to make sense of this. Is it driven by identity politics? And if it is so, then what is the projection of democracy in 10, 20 years?
Yeah, why don't we take a few questions?
What's-
Let's take a few. That's a big one.
That one is the subject of year-long courses, answering that
Yeah,
one, but
right.
it's a really interesting question.
Okay, back here and
We'll
over here.
take, yeah.
Hey, so this is a pretty open question. So I'm asking you to address my fears. I have lived all over the U.S. I've met people from all over the spectrum, and one thing I've noticed is that people on both sides seem to think that the other side is getting more extreme, and it's coming from both sides, and then it's like, this scares me. This social climate scares me, and then can one of you guys, I guess, address my fears? Thank you.
Maybe we'll start with the political scientist.
Yeah, all right. I'll say 2 quick things. Just on the rise of what you call white America's identity politics. This is not a new thing in American politics. That racism is not a new thing, xenophobia is not a new thing,
White supremacy.
white supremacy is not a new thing. However, we had looked like we made considerable progress over the last several decades, and it's very clear that what Donald Trump did, and it's hard to sort of as a political scientist who likes to look at structure. But individuals make a difference, leadership makes a difference, and Donald Trump ran a campaign that was twofold. It was meant to appeal to white working class on 2 issues. On the issue of race and bigotry, whether it was, direct, and it wasn't a dog whistle. This was letting people like this out from under their rock and telling them, you have a place in American politics. He provided them with legitimacy in the political discourse. And so he did this appeal also through economic issues, saying the Democratic Party abandoned you, industrial jobs left, you've got nothing, I will bring back industrial jobs. He did none of that, but he managed to continue to use the race issue to divide people. So we are in an extraordinary period of polarization, as was pointed out earlier by all the panelists in American politics. And to me, the part that is really something we have to contend with is the loss of moderates in the Republican Party. what you're finding now, why right wing and white supremacists are winning Republican primaries is because moderate Republicans have left the party. They are not becoming Democrats, they are becoming moderates. And this is a big place in which we have to focus our energy in American politics. And I would say quickly about this really goes to both questions about the extremism in the social climate. So I just want to say something positive about what we can do about this, and this is where political engagement is so important, and it's not just talking to your friends who agree with you. And this is a concern I have on campus right now, where students who are very active in the political arena are looking for people like them, or are looking for people who they think are like them, and they're excluding others from the political conversation. If universities can't have a political conversation with diverse opinions, and people can't listen to each other, we're really in big trouble. And I don't think we're doing a great job of that on this campus. I think today is really a wonderful day. I think this is the kind of conversation that we need to have, but we need to have it on all range of issues that people vehemently disagree about, and not do it in an exclusive way. And then you better find ways of getting active in politics, and you better vote. And if you live in New York City, go to who'sontheballot.com, and it'll tell you all about the elections. We have a social equity proposition on the ballot in New York, and I'm sure none of you know about it. So you got to get educated, you got to educate your friends and family, and you have to make sure people vote.
We got some more questions.
Yes. Right here. Oh, you're standing right there, so right there, and then over here.
Okay. I'm Catriona, and I'm in biology and GCAS. So one thing I want to first remind people is that abortion rights do not just affect women, it affects anyone that can have a pregnancy, which of course does not just include women. And then the question I want to ask is that we've talked a lot about how this ruling doesn't affect public opinion, about how the court doesn't affect public opinion, things like this, but we've also talked about voter suppression, we've talked about polarization, we've talked about money in campaigns and politics. So what about the matching of public opinion? Does it match the public opinion that has the most right in steering politics and steering voters? AKA that people that generally have money, that people are generally more upper class, white, have more time to vote, things like this.
Do you want to take another?
Let's collect a few.
Let's go.
Right here. There's two here, so we can just.
Hi, my name's Jemima. I'm in the MS full-time program here at the Journalism School. And my question for you today is, do you think that the recent Supreme Court term, and in particular the decision to overturn Roe versus Wade, has permanently affected the public opinion of the Supreme Court and its role in American society today?
Okay.
Hi, my name is Sarah. I'm also in the MS program here at the Journalism School, and my question is quite simple. We were talking about the aftermath of the Dobbs decision, and I'm wondering how there's obviously a lot of anger with the overturning of Roe v. Wade. How do we turn that anger into activism? Because I know, movements like March for Our Lives was a good example where there was just so much anger and emotion, but it sort of it failed to successfully be turned into adequate activism, and so that was sort of, that movement was a bit truncated in that way. So I'm wondering how this time around, how we can turn that properly into activism.
I'll jump in on that one. Or do you want to?
I was going to try to respond to the public
go ahead.
opinion question. I mean, I do think that, and it goes a little bit to the extreme polarization. I think that if you have a rational conversation about climate change, for example, or environmental injustice, you have got to land in a place that we cannot abdicate responsibility for regulating industry and what industry does, right? If you have a rational conversation about all of the issues that have to do with pregnancy, etc. I don't think that you can land in the place that the Supreme Court has led. I believe that. So I don't think those rational conversations are happening because there are extreme power imbalances. When you say throw it back to the state, you know, you have industry involved in getting people elected. So I think we have to get much more sophisticated about how we deconstruct what's going on to impact political opinion, right? It's not, for the reasons that have been stated here, people have wrong ideas, right? So how do we constructively change that, for one thing? I'll leave you to the next question.
Okay. So, you know, the what can we do question, or how do we respond question. I think the answer to that, and this maybe goes to the earlier question too, about just the despair, which I share to some degree. I think the answer is local. As Esther was saying, you know, we've focused a lot on court cases and sort of expected rights to remain protected on the basis of Supreme Court rulings. The Supreme Court is kicking this back to the states. What's happening in our states? I mean, supposedly, you know, Lindsey Graham notwithstanding. What's happening in our states? We don't know a lot of what's happening in our states because a lot of us don't pay attention. And part of the reason we don't pay attention is because of the bottom dropping out of local newspapers. Even, you know, after the giant loss of news media in, you know, with the advent of websites and then the financial collapse of 2008, just in the last 5 years, I think we're down by 2/3 of local papers. But we need to know what's happening, like who's in our school boards, in our local school boards, who's in our state legislatures. The Republicans have played an excellent ground game over decades to slowly win power in state legislatures, while Democrats were like kind of asleep at the switch on that question. That's one reason that these trigger laws were ready to go the minute that Roe fell. Even in states, I think Louisiana, I think there's a majority against Roe. I think there's like a 60% vote for an amendment there to outlaw abortion. But in a lot of states where it didn't reflect the majority opinion at all, there were these laws ready to go because quietly the state legislatures were preparing them, getting them ready. And so I think we need to educate ourselves locally about what's happening, engage at that local level. You know, March for Our Lives maybe hasn't changed legislation, you know, hasn't been enough to stand up against the gun lobby in Washington, but they've been pretty effective on the ground locally. There are many, many local chapters around the country that have passed local ordinances, and for you as MS students here at the J School, I'd say, you know, become journalists in small cities, do the kind of reporting that small communities need. It's not, you know, everybody doesn't have to be in New York City to be a successful journalist.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I'm toggling between sort of hope and despair in the way.
We'd like to end on a happy note.
I know.
Come on.
No, on some level, well, okay, so we
Start
have
with
this,
the despair.
We have this campus-wide constitutional democracy initiative that Lee Bollinger started, and that I'm co-chairing with. I was with Jen Purdy, one of my colleagues, it looks at the challenges and the crisis facing American constitutional democracy, and it's everything that people have talked about, and in some ways it's worse than you are even presenting when people present it, because there's so much social science, public opinion data, theoretical frameworks that just suggest intense polarization, and also a lot of the guardrails that we used to have are gone, including that of course, media, as well as party, parties not acting as guardrails. So we've always had kind of ethno-nationalist, like kind of populist conspiracy theories, all of those kinds of things have been part of the American style. But it's just, we don't have the guardrails to protect us against it sort of influencing policy. So in some ways it's worse than you think. Liliana Mason's work on identity and how people's politics have become their identity. It's not just matched onto like, oh, I happen to vote Republican or Democrat. It's all these other social identities are mapped onto it that have to do with religion and race and urban and rural. So that makes it really, if you accept all of that, it's worse than we think, but or that we're even saying. But I do get that same hope from local work, partly because you can adopt a more problem-solving approach that sometimes breaks across those kinds of partisan divides. The other thing that's hyper-local is that we at the law school are having mini conversations, just in groups of 15 around challenges facing American democracy, and faculty lead them, and it's really interesting because students do have a range of views. They're not afraid to express the range of views. Of course, it's all within certain central commitments to kind of, civil society, democracy. I won't say they're so wide-ranging. No one is trying to overthrow the American government or engage in political violence. I think it's very hard to have conversations across that level of difference. But we do have really intense and productive conversations, and I think that it's important that universities model that kind of civic discourse. And I don't know if that can, change everything that's happening in this world, but I think it begins, at least it plays a role, and it's what I can control anyway.
I'd like to add two things to this because
Only if it's helpful.
I'm in helpful mode right now, right? But I wanna, it's a challenge, right? The lowest turnout group in American elections are people between the ages of 18 and 29. That's you, okay? That is the lowest turnout group, okay? So there's something so basic here about getting your voice heard. Minimally register to vote. And if you live in one of these swing states, for God's sake, don't vote in New York. Go vote where you live. So that's the first thing you have to do. Secondly, I just really, wanna emphasize what's already been said about local. There you can get involved. You can do it through party mobilization efforts if you identify with one of the parties. But if you're an independent, how many issue organizations, and what you said is so important, at the local level, we tend to be much more about problem solving, and you can find a community of interest between people who you disagree with a lot when it comes to reducing noise pollution or picking up the trash on the street, or maybe even, schools for that matter. There's a whole range of issues that you can get involved in that would then translate to broader political engagement. The local is directly connected to the state and the national. And we were asleep at the wheel, and I think part of the Democrats were asleep at the wheel, and I think part of fixing what's broken is acknowledging how broken democratic engagement has been in this country, and particularly among youth. So let's get with the program here and start doing this work, and start right here on campus. I couldn't agree more with that.
Okay. All right. Well, you know what to do. It's all on you now.
And sorry, we didn't answer the question about is the court permanently seen differently. I think it's really hard to say. I mean, there's so much shifting. People don't stick with their opinions for very long. I mean, but I do sense some shift that's different than just disagreement with the court's opinion that's going on here.
All right. Thank you. Thank you to all our amazing panelists. Thank you. Turn it back over to Dr. Mitchell.
Oh, incredible. So on behalf of University Life, I'd like to give a big thank you to Professor Alvarez and our panel. It was just an outstanding conversation, as we promised, for sharing their time and their expertise today. Each of them is incredibly accomplished in their own right. So please go online and take a look at their portfolio, their work. You'll be you'll be proud of our leadership here and our faculty at the university. Today's discussion, as I predicted, was not simple nor easy, but it was important and definitely overdue for us to have on this campus. Whatever your perspective is, I urge you to get out and vote, because on November 8th, it's critical, and I love the swing state concept if you're from one of the swing states. If you're eligible, using our voices is critical to having a working, healthy democracy. I hope you were challenged at least in some small way by the conversation. Our goal is always to help each other look at issues with fresh eyes. I hope you will take anything you've learned here today and carry it into conversations you're having with your own communities, your own classes, your own schools. Today's event was part of University Life's calendar of events. To find out more about our programming and other initiatives, please check out our website at universitylife.columbia.edu. And I did have the conversation at the beginning about these small groups at the law school, and hope to be able to amplify that with University Life's collaboration across the university as we move forward. And lastly, thank you to everyone who has joined us today. We're grateful that you said yes, that you came in person. We're grateful for those of you online as well, watching through the live stream. We hope you learned today, and we hope you take this conversation back to your residences, your homes, your schools. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the day.